Hello students, welcome back. This is Sir Alex Pasco again for our Biology 1, and today we'll be discussing our second lesson, which will be focusing on about cell structure and its function. So last time we talked about the cell theory and the postulates of cell theory. This time we'll be talking about the cell itself and the structure of the cell and different functions of the structure of the cell. So for today's lesson, yung goal po natin is the following. For us to be able to describe the structure and function of major and subcellular organelles. So later we'll be talking about what organelles are. So what is a cell? A cell is first and foremost a building block of life. And all living things, as we know from cell postulates, all living things are made up of cell, and they could be a single cellular or a multicellular like us. So humans are examples of multicellular living organisms. Cell also is important for controlling and executing all several functions in a type of in a organism. So a living person or a living organism is alive because of the various functions that their cell is creating. So imagine no, yung ganito kaliit na parte ng isang organism is very important for that organism to continue living. Later on, we'll know bakit later on in the class we'll know why this small parts of a person or living organism is very important in their daily functioning and in their daily lives. And generally, these cells are very microscopic, meaning they can only be observed under a very high magnification electron microscope. We cannot see them with our naked eyes. And they're composed internally of numerous membranous compartments called organelles. Organelles are small compartments, they're membrane bound inside the cell. And today we'll be discussing those small parts or yung various parts of the internal structure of the cell. Cell organelles. So the first part, it's not basically an organelle, but it's what we call a cell membrane, or in other words, we call it the plasma membrane. This is what encloses the cell. This is what separates the cell from its environment. So when you think of cell, maybe you'll immediately think of a cell phone or a smartphone. But cell can also mean something that is separated, like a prison. We call it prison cell. That's why Robert Hooke, when he saw the compartment-like structure of the plant cells, he called them cells because they're compartmentalized, they're sequestered, they're isolated. And the reason for the isolation of the internal structure of the cell from its environment, uh, also we call the outside environments, we call them extracellular fluid, and the internal environment of the cell, we call it the intracellular fluid. And the cell membrane is responsible for separating the extracellular fluid from the intracellular fluid. This is important because if the internal fluid of the cell and its outer fluid mix together, the cell would not be able to support itself. It will rupture and it will die. And that rupture or that dying of the cell because of the rupture of its membrane is called a lysis. And that's one way to actually destroy a cell. So this cell membrane or this plasma membrane is made up of various or combination of phospholipids. So we call it a bilayer of phospholipid. So this example right here is a phospholipid. So it's if you attach various phospholipids together and create a structure similar to this one right here, and then double it, you'll be able to create a structure called cell membrane or plasma membrane. So this phospholipid is composed of a polar head and hydrophobic tail. So polar head is a hydrophilic. So when we say hydrophilic, it's water loving. And the tails of a phospholipid is hydrophobic. So when we say hydrophobic, it hates water. So if you have various phospholipids and you dump it in the water, what happens is that the hydrophobic tails would want to get away from the water while the polar head would want to stick to the water. So they would assume a structure similar to this, where you can see the heads right here on top and on the below. It means the extracellular fluid is composed mainly of water. So sa taas nito is basically water. And inside the cell is also composed mainly of water. So this is, well, imagine this as the inside of the cell and this is the outside of the cell. So to create this structure to be able to separate the extracellular fluid from the intracellular fluid. So later on, when you go to college, you'll study more about this. There's a lot of more functions with the extras with the cell membrane or the plasma membrane. But today we'll just make it simple and think of the reason why the separation happens because of the polar head and the hydrophobic tail, or the separation happens because of the structure of the phospholipid. It creates a bilayer that separates the extracellular fluid from the intracellular fluid. And along this bilipid layer, there are various protein and enzymes that helps regulate and transport the chemicals that is needed by the cell in and out of the cell. So what hindi lang talaga ganito, it's not just a simple lipid bilayer, but actually along those lipid bilayers, you would see a lot of transport proteins. And these transport proteins and enzymes are responsible in regulating kung ano yung lumalabas at pumapasok sa cell. We're not gonna go in depth with a lot of these because later on with our lesson or in our class we'll know more about the cell membrane. Just let's keep it as simple for now. So the cell membrane or the plasma membrane is composed of a phospholipid bilayer, and a phospholipid has a hydrophilic tail and a hydrophobic tail. And along that lipid bilayer, there's a lot of enzymes and transport proteins that is responsible in regulating what comes in and outside of the cell. Now let's continue on with the cell organelles. So kung makita nyo itong yellow na to, yun yung phospholipid bilayer natin. This is the cell membrane or the plasma membrane. So now let's talk about cytoplasm. So cytoplasm is basically the intracellular fluid of the cell. Ito yung loob ng cell. This is a jelly-like substance within the cell composed mainly of water and dissolved substances. This is responsible for the fluid nature of the cell and houses the different various organelles inside the cell. So, itong loob na to, yung loob na tinatawag natin intracellular fluid, we can also call it a cytoplasm because inside of that water-like or jelly-like substance is doon natin makikita yung various organelles ng cell. And inside the cell is we have the nucleus. The nucleus is the control center of the cell, and dito nakalagay or it houses the genetic materials of an individual. So you can see parang sequestered siya, no? Parang separated siya or isolated because we want to keep the genetic materials and the genetic makeup of the individual very, very secured kasi we don't want it to be just exposed outside. Otherwise, maraming mutation mangyayari sa isang tao. So we want the genetic makeup to be very, very secured. So that's why we have can you imagine it's a double layers of protection. So the nucleus encloses the genetic materials, and inside we can also find the nucleus where ribosomes are, So ribosomes are important for synthesizing proteins from RNAs. Later on in our discussion, we'll know more about the ribosomes. Oh, here. So ribosomes is made up of two subunits and associated with the mRNA and responsible for the synthesis of proteins. So when you think of proteins, you'll probably imagine a meat that you eat, no? Parang yung karne na kinakain natin, for example, like a steak. But proteins are long chains of amino acids that folds together to create a 3D structure that gives the protein its function. And that chain of amino acids were connected together by the ribosomes. So ginagawa ng ribosomes is yung two units niya, magdudugtong sila or magkoconnect sila, and it will read mRNA. And as it read the codes that is in the mRNA, it synthesizes proteins. So it will choose the proper um, amino acids, and as it go along the line of the mRNA and it reads the three-letter code ng DNA or ng code na nasa mRNA, it produces proteins. I think later on in our class we'll know more how protein synthesis works. So for now, let's just think of ribosomes as two subunits that reads the mRNA and creates the proteins needed for us to live. Next is the endoplasmic reticulum. Endoplasmic reticulum is continuous to the cell, to the membrane of the nucleus. So when we say continuous, as you can see here, the nucleus natin, it has a membrane and it continues on. You're connected sila from the membrane of the nucleus to the endoplasmic reticulum. So it's continuous, and there's two types of endoplasmic reticulum. One is the rough endoplasmic reticulum, and the second one is the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. So yung basically difference lang nila is that the rough endoplasmic reticulum looks grainy under the microscope because of the various ribosomes attached to it. Yung smooth endoplasmic reticulum does not have any, as you can see here, it does not have any ribosomes attached to it. So yung function ng rough endoplasmic reticulum is serves as the transit for proteins synthesized by the ribosomes. So as you can see here, maraming ribosomes, so meaning they synthesize the proteins. And ang ginagawa ng endoplasmic reticulum, which is attached, or kung saan naka-attach yung ribosomes, is that it becomes a transit or it transports the proteins from the endoplasmic reticulum and later to the Golgi complex. Samantala, yung smooth endoplasmic reticulum, wala siyang ribosomes, pero yung function niya is it functions as a metabolic. It serves a purpose for the metabolic processes inside the cells. So it dissolves a lot of the things that is needed for the cell to survive. So like the nutrients that it needs. Next is the Golgi bodies. So as mentioned earlier, yung ribosomes na naka-attach sa endoplasmic reticulum, it creates the proteins. And then the endoplasmic reticulum transits these from here to the Golgi complex. Ang ginagawa na ngayon ng Golgi complex is it refine yung protein. So as sinabi ko kanina, yung protein is a long chain of amino acids. So after i-create nung ribosomes, yung long chain na yon, and yung endoplasmic reticulum, transport niya sa Golgi complex or sa Golgi bodies. Ang ginagawa ngayon ng Golgi bodies is it refine it by being responsible in folding the proteins. And we need to fold the proteins to give the proteins its functions like I mentioned earlier. So yun yung isang ginagawa ng Golgi apparatus or Golgi bodies. So it refines the proteins by folding it. It's also important in packaging and sorting out proteins, which later on will be transported by the Golgi vesicles. So Golgi bodies is made up of piles of flattened sacs called cisternae. So as you can see, they're kind of like a sac that is flattened, and these flattened sacs are called cisternae, and this composition of cisternae creates the Golgi apparatus or Golgi bodies. Next, vacuole. So vacuole serves as the main compartment for sorting essential organic and inorganic compounds. So ito yung parang you can think of it as the basurahan ng ating uh, cell, because this is the disposal site for the unneeded and harmful substances inside the cells, and they are larger in plants than in animals. So vacuole. So when there are substances inside the cell that are not needed anymore, ang ginagawa is that they're all compartmentalized, or they are um, parang na-store sila sa vacuole. Lysosomes. Lysosomes are exclusively found on animals, and they contain hydrolytic enzymes that are used to digest macromolecules. Ang ginagawa ng lysosomes is eating responsible for the recycle of various macromolecules. Macromolecules meaning bigger molecules. So, halimbawa, ito yung sa yung lysosome natin. Halimbawa, ito yung lysosome natin. And ang nangyari is nasira yung part nung, let's say, Golgi bodies. So, ang ginagawa ng lysosomes is that it digests that damaged part of inside the cell and breaks it into various monomers, which can be recycled by the cell. So, kung isipin natin, very efficient yung cells because kapag may na-damage na organelles inside, kakainin siya ng lysosome via autophagy and destroys that damaged part of the cell and breaks it down into various monomers. And ang gagawin ng cell is yung mga monomers na yun is i-recycle niya to create another organelles inside for the cell to continue living. So kapag may na-damage inside the cells, kakainin siya ng lysosomes via autophagy and then breaks down that damaged part into monomers, which then will be reused or recycled by the cells. And lysosomes were able to break down or digest those damaged materials into monomers because it has hydrolytic enzymes. So it's an enzyme that's able to dissolve those various damaged materials. Next, you might be familiar, mitochondria. So this is an example of mitochondria right here. And as we know, this is the powerhouse of the cell. When we say powerhouse, because it's the one responsible for creating a lot of ATPs. So ATPs are the energy needed by the cell to continue functioning. Ito yung energy na ginagamit natin in order for us to keep uh, to, to still be alive. So later on in our class, we'll be discussing how the mitochondria creates a lot of these ATPs via respiration. Uh, but for now, just think of mitochondria as parts of the cell and organelle, which is responsible for creating a lot of ATPs. That's why we call it the powerhouse of the cell. Next, chloroplasts. So chloroplasts only exist in animals. And this is important for because it has the chlorophyll, which is a green pigment, which is responsible for capturing the light from the sunlight and converts that light to carbon dioxide, water, and sugar. So the chloroplast contains the chlorophyll, which is a green pigment, which captures the light and converts that light into CO2, water, and sugar for the plant's food, or for it to be able to make food like fruits or even flowers, for it to continually to grow and for it to continually to develop. Next, cytoskeleton. Again, so chloroplast is only found in plants or eukaryotic plants or photosynthetic organisms. Humans and animals, a lot of them are not photosynthetic, so we cannot find the chloroplast inside our cells. Next, cytoskeleton is responsible for establishing the form of the cell. So you can think of it as the skeleton. If humans have skeleton, cells must also have skeleton. Remember cytoplasm, which is the inside fluid, the fluid inside the cell. Inside that fluid, we can find the skeletons, and it's mainly made of microfilaments, microtubules, and intermediate filaments. We're not going to go deep into the discussion of these because if you go to college and study more about cellular biology, you will go in depth more about microfilaments, microtubules, and intermediate filaments and their purposes. But for intents and purposes for this class, all we just think of them as the skeleton inside the cytosol, which holds the structure of the cell. Next, cilia and flagella are specialized structures of a cell. Not all cells have them. Uh, Cilia and flagella are responsible for locomotion. So, cilia are like hair-like structure around the cell, while flagella is a tail-like structure attached to a cell. And because of the cytoskeleton, especially I think it was the microtubules, uh, responsible for the movement of this hair-like structure and tail-like structure. And because of this structure, nakakagalaw yung cell. You can think of this as a sperm cell. The sperm cell has a flagella, it has a tail. And because of the microtubules and actin uh, sa tail na yun, it kind of like it swirls the tail in order for the sperm cell to move inside the vaginal area to be able to fertilize an egg. So that's all for today. Yun yung lahat ng cell organelles that we're going to discuss inside the cell structures. So I hope if you guys have any questions, do not hesitate to contact me. And you guys have a great day.